History is written by the victors. But the map is drawn by the survivors. Welcome to Atlas of the Eerie, where we chart the dark, bloody, and impossible coordinates the world desperately wants you to forget. They tell you the ocean is a graveyard. But graveyards have rules. Graveyards have headstones, timelines, and an understanding that what goes into the earth, stays there. The Pacific Ocean has no such rules. On February 11, 1979, 5 men vanished into the worst storm in Hawaii's modern history. For 10 agonizing years, the world accepted that Ralph Maliakini, John Trujillo, George Harrison, Benny Kalama, and Scott Moorman were dead. Swallowed by the abyss. But the ocean didn't keep them. A decade later, it gave them back. What was found on a desolate, unmapped island 2,000 miles away defies physics, oceanography, and human logic. The math does not add up. The timeline is impossible. And the grave they found waiting in the sand suggests a reality far more terrifying than a simple shipwreck. The morning began like any other in Hana, Maui. The air was thick, the sun was blinding, and the water was deceptively calm. The 5 friends loaded a cooler of beer and some fishing gear into a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. It was supposed to be a 2-hour joyride along the coast. But by noon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. Without warning, a massive, localized gale slammed into the Alanwihaha Channel. We are talking about hurricane-force winds and 50-foot swells. A 17-foot fiberglass boat in those conditions isn't a vessel. It is a coffin. When the Sarah Joe failed to return, the U.S. Coast Guard launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in Pacific history. For 5 days, a massive fleet of ships and aircraft scoured 73,000 square miles of ocean. They found absolutely nothing. Not a life jacket. Not a cooler. The Sarah Joe had simply ceased to exist. The families mourned. Funerals were held without bodies. And the world moved on. Fast forward exactly 10 years. September 9, 1989. John Naughton, a marine biologist working for the National Marine Fisheries Service, is on a highly specialized expedition in the Marshall Islands. He is surveying the Tongi Atoll. You need to understand what Tongi is. It is an uninhabitable, razor-sharp crescent of dead coral and sand, 2,000 miles southwest of Hawaii. It has no fresh water. No trees. As Naughton's team walks the desolate shoreline, they see something that freezes the blood in their veins. Sitting perfectly upright in the sand, completely intact, is a small fiberglass boat. The registration numbers on the hull are faded, but legible. Ha, 5931. It was the Sarah Joe. Finding the boat 10 years later was a miracle. But the miracle ended the moment they walked 60 feet inland. Sitting just beyond the high tide line was a shallow, meticulously constructed grave. It was marked by a crude cross made of driftwood, lashed together with wire. Naughton's team carefully brushed away the sand, uncovering a nightmare. Protruding from the shallow earth was a human jawbone. Dental records would quickly confirm the unthinkable. The bone belonged to Scott Moorman, the 27-year-old crew member of the Sarah Joe. But the horror wasn't the bone itself. It was what was buried with it. Stacked neatly on top of the jawbone, like a bizarre, primitive offering, was a thick stack of blank paper. Not a journal. Not a map. Just 3 by 3 inch squares of completely unlined paper, interleaved with pieces of tin foil. The media called it a tragic closure. But forensic investigators and oceanographers looked at the data, and realized that the discovery of the Sarah Joe didn't solve a mystery. It created an impossible paradox. Let's look at the math. Oceanographers ran hundreds of drift simulations. Based on the currents in 1979, it is scientifically proven that the Sarah Joe would have taken a maximum of 3 to 4 months to drift from Maui to the Tongi Atoll. If the boat arrived in 1979, who dug a fresh grave 10 years later? A jawbone cannot bury itself. The cross was tied with wire, a deliberate, human action requiring hands, tools, and cognitive thought. If the men died in the storm, the boat would have washed up empty. If Scott Mormon survived the 3-month drift, he couldn't have buried his own remains. For decades, the official narrative has been a shrug of the shoulders. A tragic anomaly of the sea. But there is a theory. A theory that the government has never officially commented on, because the implications are deeply, profoundly disturbing. To understand it, you have to look at the map. The Tongi Atoll doesn't just sit in the middle of nowhere. It is part of the Marshall Islands. And during the Cold War, the Marshall Islands were the staging ground for the United States military's most secretive, highly illegal nuclear and biological testing programs. What if the men of the Sarah Joe didn't die in the storm? Imagine it. You survive a catastrophic hurricane. You drift for 3 agonizing months under a blistering sun. Finally, your boat scrapes against the coral. You pull yourself ashore, only to stumble into a heavily guarded military black site. You just became the biggest liability in the Pacific Ocean. The grave wasn't dug by Mormon's friends. It was a rushed, sloppy cover-up. And that mysterious blank paper? Forensic analysts suggest it was likely a military logbook or radiation ledger. Over 10 years, the ink simply washed away. The government has never released the full satellite imagery of Tongi from 1979. Scott Mormon was the only piece of the crew left behind. The ocean didn't take the other 4 men. Something else did. This has been Atlas of the Eerie. If you want to uncover the dark corners of the map the world wants you to forget, hit subscribe. Until next time, keep looking over your shoulder.